Okay, so this week we enter into Southeast Asian refugees, one of the last groups that we will study for this class. And the main one being the primary one being Vietnamese refugees. But in order to understand why Vietnamese refugees came to the U.S., we need to understand that there was a war in Vietnam known as the Vietnam War, and the United States got involved in this war. The United States went into war in Vietnam in order to stop the spread of communism and to assist the Vietnamese in the South from becoming uh, communist and staying a free society, which is known as the Truman Doctrine. And it was a very long war. And at first it was popular, but later on, because it was broadcasted um, and recorded so much by journalists, it came to be unpopular. But the conflict really that started the Vietnam War started shortly after World War II. With World War II, the French lost control of its colonial empire in Southeast Asia, which included Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Now, the French colonized these three Southeast Asian countries since the 15th century, and but they were during World War II. They were fighting with Italy and Germany back home in Europe, and they just couldn't sustain or maintain colonizing Vietnam. But so during World War II, they actually lost control of Vietnam, and the Japanese forces came in and colonized it. But with the end of World War II, the French attempted to recolonize Southeast Asia, recolonize Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And the U.S. supported them in that because the U.S. wanted to stop the spread of communism in that region. And so the first Indo-Chinese War really was between North Vietnamese forces led by Ho Chi Minh and the French. And Vietnam was split between North and South with the Geneva Accord in the summer of 1954. And the North Vietnamese were supported by the Soviet Union as well as China. And of course, the South was being supported by by America's military and CIA and FBI. Now, what eventually led us into the actual war itself was so before the Tonkin Gulf crisis, um, there was already U.S. Troops on the ground and the U.S. supporting the French. However, it wasn't until August 1964 that there was an alleged attack on two U.S. battleships in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam and by North Vietnamese forces. And right away, President Johnson went and got congressional approval to officially declare war in Vietnam. However, uh, uh, after they investigated the remains of the battleship, they didn't find it. It wasn't there. And so we know now that the Gulf of Tonkin attack was a false attack. It was made up. It was a lie. And for this reason, many people uh, critique and criticize the war in Iraq under George W. Bush and his search for weapons of mass destruction that Iraq and Saddam Hussein allegedly had, but they never found. So Vietnam's Tonkin Gulf is the war in Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. So two wars that the U.S. fought based on a lie. Now, uh, and so the war was pretty complex and it lasted very long, and the Viet Cong forces were pretty strong, and the Americans were never able to really win this war. And the public was starting to sense this in the U.S. Through anti-Vietnam War protests. And that became really strong with what is known as the Tet Offensive in early 1968. So Tet is Vietnamese Lunar New Year. And during this time, when there should be no fighting because they're all going to celebrate Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the Viet Cong forces attacked several uh, U.S. Military camps and Vietnamese cities in the south. And by that time, you know, the Americans just realized this is not a winnable war, even though the president was selling it as a winnable war. And so Nixon would run for president um, during this period, and he won in part for his doctrine of Vietnamization. He says, I have a plan to win this war and for us to leave with honor, and that's Vietnamization. And Vietnamization literally means to let the South Vietnamese fend for themselves, right? And that's what we did. So, so with anti-war protests and U.S. slow withdrawal, the United States slowly did withdraw, and it wasn't until April of 1975 that the U.S. fully withdrew from Vietnam, and the United States lost that war. And because of that, the first wave of refugees who left with U.S. personnel and U.S. officials, military officials, were mainly ethnic Vietnamese. They spoke English or French, and they had ties and connection with the U.S. military or U.S. government. And so that they left in 1975. And between 1975 and 1979, many ethnic Chinese Vietnamese were escaping Vietnam by boat. And that led to an international refugee crisis. And that international refugee crisis resulted in Vietnamese refugees as well as Cambodian and Laotian refugees being admitted into the U.S. as refugees. Now, the U.S., although they were fighting a war in Vietnam, we also were had military action in Laos and Cambodia as well, which we'll cover when we study Cambodian and refugees from Laos, including Hmongs. So, those were the two waves. The first wave coming right after the war, and the second wave coming by 1980 with the passage of the Refugee Act.